Hello and welcome to this first episode of the QMed Academy Talks, where we will discuss, Søren and I together, the technical documentation which is needed during the development of a medical device. So today we will talk about the standalone documents, which are coming out of the processes from your quality management system, which is based on the individual standards, regulations, and so on. And Søren, will you start out by taking us through how we would suggest that you actually look at a device development project?
Yeah, and I think for when we see clients come to us and during their development stage, the first thing I want to talk about is device description. That's a super important document. And though it might seem obvious to describe your device, actually putting it in writing is not that obvious. And you really need to describe your device in all means possible, because you need to remember those that evaluate and approve your device in the end, they don't have your device. They don't know the history. They don't know the stages that you've been through. So you need to provide that information.
And what would you put into such a document? It's not just a 10-liner. It's
No.
What are the specific sections that you will recommend that you put in such a document? And when do you start out?
Early on. It's not that you can't, rewrite your device description at all. Actually, a very good thing would also be to keep history of it. So, as you mentioned, the QMS kind of formatting where you have versioning. So you'll most likely start out with a prototype of your device and do some testing along the way, and then you maybe develop on that prototype. But it's very important to show the coherence in your development stages and also your device description. So that could be that you changed, if it's a software, you changed a certain aspect of your software during your development. Well, what was the cause of that? And that might be some very important information you need in your device description to understand your process.
And would you put in a change log in that document also? Or I found it very helpful, actually.
Yeah.
It was not a question. I want to recommend to add a change log so that you can see from each version of the document what was actually the changes.
Yeah, and of course, depending on how your QMS system is built up, either sort of a physical entity within the document or however your QMS system logs changes. So yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to, I normally look at a document and then I visualize, the flow. What would be a good flow in such a document? How would you, do you have some clinical introduction, or is that not necessary here? Or do you, these are the material, this is the design. How will you build up a good device description?
A very good thing to start with is sort of your regulatory input. What class is it? If you have made your serial numbers and so on, that would be a very good way to start your document. And then from there, it would be the intended purpose or intended use, depending on market you go into. And with intended use, and you have your contraindications, your precautions and warnings and so on. So from there, it's so, yes, that is a bit clinical, but it's also a very good input to have there. Sort of the medical background, I wouldn't put it in that document. It belongs somewhere else. So it is a very good description of your device. See it like you want to hand it over to someone that basically doesn't know that much about your device or even devices in general.
Yeah.
So if you can explain it to someone that doesn't know what a device is, then you have a good device description.
And then we actually, we have discussed to use a case during these sessions, and if we introduce the case now, and then I will ask you again what to add for a software in this document.
Yeah, we talked a lot about using a case, and
we gave up on the first one.
Yeah, the first one was...
It was too difficult for us.
A fully AI surgical robot, but there were so many interlinked devices that actually need to talk to each other during a surgery that it would be way too complicated.
Yeah.
So, no, an endoscopic camera, making a software for that could identify pathologies and also like very important anatomical structures during surgery.
What is an endoscope? Just for really...
It's a camera that you insert through an incision in your skin. It's very commonly used for abdominal surgeries, where you would, depending on what surgery you perform, you would insert it by a small incision in the abdominal wall and then go in and visualize the area where you want to perform a surgery.
Or you use the natural openings, as we call it.
That's true. You can also use it for visualizing your stomach or the other way.
So how would you, if you have a software included in a device or as a standalone, here is combined with a mechanical device.
Yeah.
How detailed should the description of the software be in the device description?
Yeah. So first of all, as I mentioned before, what is the intended purpose of the device? Then secondly, I would actually also keep claims and benefits within a device description for good sake, because we need to know sort of what is the purpose of this device. And then in describing your device, well, we need to know what is the input. So for this case matter, it would be a recording. So basically live video, and depending on what video source you have, it's like a white light. And that video source you need to describe as your input. So you probably also need to describe in what format you need it. And then secondly, because most softwares now use algorithms, you need to describe your algorithm. You can't submit something that is a black box. You need to show the evaluators, how does my algorithm actually interpret the input to become an output? And the output should then be your performance or your benefit, right? But what we see often, especially with software, is that it becomes a black box. So what is it, when you have a recording like that, what is it that you actually evaluate? Is it like anatomical landmarks? Is it the coloring? Those things need to describe, because your algorithm runs on something. So these inputs are super important because your algorithms makes decisions. And for evaluator, they need to know those decisions.
Super. We actually see very often, as you say, this black box. It's a device with a software, and then they describe the device, but the software is not really specified. And this is not enough, both for us as readers of the document and trying to understand how we can document the device safety and performance or efficacy, but also for the regulators that the data that they receive for evaluation is actually sufficient to based on what they read. So I think this is really an important point to remember. So if we take some of the other documents, the standalone documents, we have a classification statement.
Yeah, and that's something you need to do, dependent on market. So if your intention is to go into the European market, well, then you need to follow the MDR for classification and then classify your device accordingly. And for software, there is a special rule that you need to follow called the Rule 11. But besides that, because you're a software, you also need to know that you're an active device. And depending on how your software is created or your device in general is created, you need to evaluate all rules. So it's not just saying, well, I'm rule 7 and I'm an invasive device and so on. No, you need to evaluate each rule if it applies to you. And there is a lot of templates out there that you can easily find and see how it's created. And of course, we have our own that we go with. And besides that, of course, if you need to go to the US market, it's different classification rules. So we need to be aware of that.
But what you're saying is that if we take the European classification and would do that for a client, we go through all the different statements. And the ones not applicable, we actually document not applicable and why it's not applicable.
Exactly.
Because it's not just enough to leave them blank. That will be a notification or non-conformity. And then I think maybe important also to mention is these MDCG guidelines here, because that is my new best friend. That is the one on classification. Because there is a lot of devices that are in the gray zone between medicine and a device. But maybe you can, how you use that guideline.
That's definitely true.
Can you remember the number? Because I can't.
No, I actually can't remember.
We will put that in the chat.
As you said, there's quite a lot. No, anyway, but the thing about classification is, and the good thing is, now we talked about it just before, is, the device description. So it's very important for us to know the device. For example, something that is spring-loaded will be considered active device, right? And if you use manual power, like in a syringe, it's a class 1 device because you move from class 1 to class 2A just by adding a spring to your syringe.
These are some of the hardest discussions I've had with clients.
And it's
it's a difficult one.
It is, and we really need to consider all instances of the specifications of a device.
But maybe explain what is the difference between a class 1 and a 2A? Why is it so important?
Most of the time, it's due to your sort of approval process. But besides that, it's also like a well-known that those that are class 1, they do less documentation than class 2A and 2B and class 3. So, of course, if you move up the ladder, being class 3 as the highest risk device, well, we should expect a lot of, like a company in your technical file will be very huge. Whereas class 1, they get off a little easier.
And they're self-certified.
Yeah, and they're self-certified.
They don't need to find a notified body, but they can get a visit from the competent authority. They can,
and it happens.
It happens.
So it's, that's...
Or anyone can get a visit, right?
Yeah.
But,
and they also need to be aware, especially if you're class 1. Let's say you're based in Spain and your competent authority is the Spanish authorities, but you are selling in France, then the French authorities can also initiate a visit through the Spanish ones. It's, even though you are class 1, you still need to be aware that if you try to push the whole European market.
They talk together.
Yeah. Actually, quite often.
Quite often. Yeah. They know each other. So then we have the next document to mention is the essential requirement, or the GSPR, the General Safety and Performance Requirement.
Yeah.
And then we normally say checklist, but it's actually not a checklist. It's a document.
It is a document, yes. And since you mentioned it, the essential requirements is for other than EU markets. General safety and performance requirements, those are related specifically for EU. There is a lot of overlay in between the two. And for those clients that are in several markets, we tend to have it together, depending on how their QMS is built up. But this document is where you go in to each of the requirements and then state what documents you have made in order to conform to these requirements. And this is also something I would start out with early.
It's basically your plan, right? You
Yeah.
start to plan out what do I actually need to test to demonstrate this requirement. And the requirements are coming directly from the regulation.
Yeah.
And then you have all the other guidelines to support that. And here's the same, right? You have to put your justification if you write that, oh, I don't think this requirement is applicable.
Yeah.
You need to write why.
Yeah, exactly, like the classification statement. So you need to evaluate each of them. And from 1 to 9, that pretty much applies to all devices, though there are exceptions. And then they are called the general runs. So therefore they apply to most devices. And when you move a little further down, they have specific ones.
Like for software, like for our test case, there will be a specific section.
There is specific ones, yes. And they also for ionizing devices like X-ray, MR, and other image devices. And also if you have like a drug-device combination, there is also special GSPRs you need to follow.
And if we use our test case and I was a client and I asked, Søren, I need you to do my GSPR. This is early start.
Yeah.
How long time would it take you to complete a GSPR checklist? Which is not a checklist. It's a document. Again.
I think initially we would start out and then have a look at it. What would be applicable? And then we'll come back to the client, and that first evaluation is somewhere around 8-10 hours, depending on the device. And then we need to revisit it, because once your process of development is ongoing, and this can be years, well, then you create the documents that justify your adherence to the requirements. So early on, you wouldn't know the document number for a certain document that is actually the reason why you fulfill a certain requirement. And then also for most of our clients and for most devices, they need clinical studies, and this is one of the documents that you need for submission. So starting early and evaluating what documents you actually need to prove is also a good thing.
And you are listing the specific test report, just to be very practical.
Yeah.
This is not just it's not a summary of what you think you found.
No.
It is actually for the notified body to see that this requirement in this test report, you have the data that demonstrates together with all the other things.
Yeah.
This will show that it's safe and performs and
exactly.
Yeah.
And they will review it. And it's just the last, I would say, 6 months. We have gotten a lot of cases where the competent authority asks for documents within your GSPR checklist. So don't just write a number there.
No.
If you don't have the document.
It's really and it's a huge document when it's done.
Yeah.
Irrespective of the class, I think there are normally a lot of details put in here when it's done correct. If we jump to the next one, this is the regulatory and clinical strategy. It's also called a regulatory compliance plan, I think, under the MDR. So we used this previously as a business strategy document, but now it's actually a technical document. Can you explain how this is used?
Yeah, for our clients, it's and we try to describe the process that they need to go through. And whereas we kind of talked about the GSPR checklist being sort of, let's say, your document control overlay, a strategy would be something else. A strategy would be where, how can you approach a certain market? What would be the expectations for your device? So if we take the case, well, if you do interoperative interoperative software that needs to evaluate a lot of stuff, well, then we definitely need to look up in a higher class. And then we need in the strategy to evaluate what can we do in order for an approval of this device. And in regulatory compliance, of course, you have your the overall regulation or the guidance that might come from FDA. But besides that, you have standards, you have guidance documents. So all these things need to be evaluated.
And this is in the MDR, we have a lot of plans that leads to some reports.
Yeah.
So this is also a plan, and it needs to be updated during the whole, basically, process of developing this device.
Yeah. And the thing about a strategy is that, it's initially you normally make it to one market. But along the way and during development and your process after market, you might want to push for different markets. So you start in EU, you want to push for US, then you develop your strategy.
And then we have also another standalone document, which sometimes is included in this document, I would think. For some of our clients, this is the list of applicable standards.
Yeah.
So I see all different kinds with 10 standards or just the MDR and FDA.
Yeah.
How would you use this document?
A good thing here is, start from your device description, and we'll actually get into it in sort of the next talks about requirement specification. But there is so many standards out there. And we have a set list of that we go through with clients and see if they're applicable to their device. And then you would have specific standards. So if you're producing a heart valve, you have a specific ISO standard for a heart valve on what requirements that come there. So for each device, we go in and see if there is specific standards, and if not specific, then related standards. It could be something like a guide wire. Well, that could be related to certain catheter standards because it's compatible. Or you have, there is a standard on Lurlock lockings on syringes and so on. So if you're creating some kind of new technology that can apply to a Lurlock fitting, then you need to use that standard.
And how to practically actually find these?
You search for it. And then you have someone that knows what they're searching for.
So you look for the European Commission, their regulations, the FDA. They both have very good homepages.
Yeah.
The ISO organization's homepage.
Yeah.
Clinical guidelines. These are published as literature. So you go through PubMed or whatever and look for guidelines. And then Google is your best friend, right?
Yeah, for that matter, actually, yes.
Yeah.
But as you say, clinical guidelines is also important because there you would... It's not sort of the same thing. You would not include it in your applied standard list, but you definitely need to include it in other documents that talk about sort of the clinical side of it. Because there is instances in these guidelines that not only do they recommend stuff, but they actually demand a certain procedure on how your device needs to be used. So that could also be, for our case here, well, there might be clinical guidelines actually stating how it should be used. And that's very important to highlight because that could affect the strategy.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And the last document we want to mention in this session with standalone documents are the IFU.
Yeah.
Can you put some words on this document that we all know, which is which we think is straightforward, but is actually quite complex to set up?
It is, actually. Because when you have your device description, you are talking to a different audience than within your IFU. So your IFU is your communication in understanding your device.
To the users, right?
Yeah, to the users. So not only do you need to have all the formalities in place, the requirements, you also need to describe how your device actually works. And that can sometimes be a little tricky, and that's also why you have a subset of validation called usability studies. So not only do you need to look into standards, ISO standards for what is required within your IFU and also MDR for the EU market, you also need to think about how you want to present your device. There is a lot of creative solutions on how to do it, and is it an electronic IFU? How is that then sort of interacting with it? And also you need to know your user. If you're selling your device to a very specialized medical field or surgeon of any type, they have a certain knowledge bar, right? If we are selling something to a lay user, being the normal you and me, they have a very different view upon how to understand a document like an IFU.
Yeah. And I think with all of these standalone documents, we will in the next coming sessions, we will come back to that, because I think especially with the IFU, it's important to understand that it is of course a description on how to use the product, but it's linked to the clinical evaluation, the clinical trial, the usability, the risk assessment, the regulation. So this is really a complex document.
It is.
But we will come back to that. So
you would
try to elaborate in the next session. So see you for the next time. Thank you very much.